He's definitely brutal, he's always savage, and you're definitely getting wrecked.
Whenever I think about esports professionals, sure, you're embedded in the scene and you know this player, and sometimes you judge them without thinking of their age or who they are. You just think of like what the ideal of a pro should be or what you expect from someone in terms of professionalism. But whenever I look at people in general, I try as a sort of model to consider them, and especially to try and be compassionate, to think of them almost from an anthropological approach. Imagine this was like a nature documentary and we're David Attenborough, like, and we see here the young esports pro. He's attempting to enter the scene and gain status and skrill. But of course he must challenge the old veteran. Now the veteran has tools of his own to end the conflict bloodlessly. Like, you know, one of those scenarios. Like, so you think of all the players in different esports games who are the young guys. They're pros who are quite young, but we think to ourselves, yeah, you're young, but you know, you're 18, you know, society considers you an adult, or you're 19, or you're 20. What, you've been playing for 2 years. At this point, you're practically a veteran. You've played lots of tournaments. These are still pretty young players. And when I reel off some of them, you can see that they all have their own either personality and character flaws or flaws in terms of behavior and attitude. So in CSGO, we've got people like Smooya, someone who's trash talking, bantering, but people have a hard time seeing where the lines are then. Is he being serious? Is he just being rude and obnoxious? Simple, obviously, was called very toxic because he was quite abusive to teammates and opponents early in his career. Someone like Naf was flaming his own teammates, at times seems ambivalent or just indifferent even to his own team and his own situation. Someone like Flamey was just tilting off the face of the planet. Device had a big problem with choking in big matches in the past. You go to a game like Dota 2, Arteezy's been one of the most talented Dota players of the last 3, 4, 5 years, but he hasn't sometimes been able to win the biggest championship. People sometimes question like some of his team decisions, hopping around from team to team, players getting kicked from his squads, or maybe he needs a very specific type of teammate. You think of Sumail, again, an amazing talent, but only really won on a big scale with that very specific team that was built around him and really set him up. Hasn't had as much success sometimes playing with more talent. Even more recently, Anna of OG, who just won the international, was someone who seemed like he was kind of actually like a failed talent when you looked at him when he was initially in OG and when he was in some of the teams in the past. In League of Legends, obviously some classic examples. In the old school, it was Doublelift throughout his CLG days where people felt like he was a terrible teammate and he also wasn't as dedicated always himself individually. You had someone like Jensen, who obviously literally was banned for being a very obnoxious person who had a very bad attitude and then had to become a good teammate and even was benched this year perhaps for not being willing to play a certain style. Even Bjergsen, again, I'd pick him as someone who had a lot of success and was a good teammate, but he was maybe a harsh teammate and he was someone who's trying to figure out who he was himself. So there's all these factors that you look into, but age is also a key factor here, because when we're discussing pro players, sure, there's lots of angles we could go with a new player that don't have to be about their age. It could just be about the fact that they're new to having fame, new to being in the spotlight. That takes time to adjust. You have to try things out. Sometimes you don't know where the line is till you've gone over the line, then you go, fuck, that was where the line was, right? Let me get back under that. Like, this is one of the problems with adjusting to that environment, and there's no primer for this. Fans don't understand this, so they're not going to be as compassionate necessarily because they haven't experienced it themselves. It's harder for them to relate. There's also the fact that you're learning to play under pressure in a new environment with a big stage, literal spotlights on you. Maybe a scenario you've never been in before with a crowd and people cheering, and you're in a country in a temperature and whatever, all these factors that can be different from what you're used to. You're also, by the way, in all this setting, learning to play versus the very best players in the world. There's people who are veterans, who are established. They've gotten over a lot of these issues. They're not going to choke in the match, and you're trying to get into that environment, and it's one of those like welcome to the NBA type scenarios where they like push you and they go, come on, young buck, welcome to the NBA. It's how we're going to do things now. And you have to get into that new game, as it were. You're also dealing with making a lot more money than you've ever made before, actually making good money for the real world now, having status. Then you're in the scenario where everyone's praising you. Oh, you're this young talent. You're going to be the next big thing. Like, oh, you're doing so well. Oh, don't worry about that bad tournament. How do you deal with that? How's your attitude going to be? Are you going to get a big ego? So I thought some food for thought, and this is the main drive of this video, regarding players who seem to have a big ego or have difficulty performing under pressure, or their public attitude is either misperceived or it comes across very poorly. is, yes, they're often young, but it goes beyond just the number of their age. You can't look at their number and go, well, when I was 19, or what a normal kid who's 19 would have these responsibilities and think of life this way. Because remember, these are people who started playing the game heavily, often years before that, when they were teenagers. And it's only now that their game's been able to come together and culminate with them being a top pro. So it's not even like they just now started the game. They started years and years ago. And by the time they get to a top pro level, it's usually between the ages of 17 and 20 or so. Like, when someone's above like 25, we now consider them older in esports, when few of them ever get to 30 and are still active top pros. So we're basically dealing primarily with inexperienced and immature people, not least because the scene in the past and just the circumstances of the scene contrasted to normal everyday life was basically filtering out the most experienced and mature people. So we didn't have those veterans to pass on some of their understanding or set a tone for the scene and the attitude and kind of the locker room environment. Now, it's not even that it's just, as I said, their age. Like, this guy's 18. What should we expect from an 18-year-old? My general experience from knowing a lot of pro players throughout all of esports history is most of these pros aren't actually even as mature as people their age, but it's entirely understandable. They haven't had the same life experiences as those people. They haven't been going to a university in a new place and experiencing what it's like there and meeting all different cultures and peoples and trying to date girls and get to know them and try to deal with their professor and be dealt with differently from when they were a student, when they were at high school, and being a bit more authoritative from their teachers, getting that kind of an attitude. Now they've got more of like a collaborative thing and there's more responsibility given and they have to learn how to take care of themselves. Some of them aren't doing these things. Some of them literally are in a scenario where the average fan or average guy out there might not be able to relate to them. This guy's going to seem a bit weird. He's going to seem a bit too intense, or he's going to seem a bit socially miscalibrated, is how I'd say. Because I don't think it's that these people can't do it. It's just that they haven't, and they haven't put in the same effort there, because they've been putting that effort into being very good at a video game. And so they're going to come off as weird to you because they're not going to directly connect up, or you're not going to always be able to relate to the way they perceive the world and what their value structure is, or hierarchy, as it were, and what they kind of consider more important than other things, and some of the very weird things that they don't consider important that to us, like being polite, etc., might be very important. It might be a key aspect of society for a normal bloke. Because remember, these are people who not only have been playing video games all day, most of them have been playing one video game the majority of each day, some of them for a couple of years, some of them for 5 years, some of them for 10 years at this point in time. They have no time for almost anything else, generally, especially, by the way, people in team houses, like in the Chinese daughter houses or in League of Legends, in the NALCS, etc. Some of the CSGO teams in NA are all in a team house. They're having even less opportunity to properly socialize, and they're even more intense on the practice and all just being about this game. Their entire life's about this game. So that's going to make you very intensely and very specifically weird, in a way that even other weird people and eccentric and quirky people might not be. You might not have a basic ground level of socialization, because even when you've been socialized in the past, when you were at school, when you did have friends, when you had a girlfriend, when you're out in the real world doing a part-time job before you made it as an esports pro, you lose that eventually, just as you had to build it up. You weren't just born coming out the womb knowing how to talk and how to deal with people. You had to learn through going to initial schools. Oh, this is how you play with people. Then you go to a school where they start teaching you, oh, listen to your teachers, look at the way, do this exam, remember details for the exam, don't behave in this certain way, do these things I say. Like, you gradually brought into socialization to become a human, to become civilized, to become part of human civilization. And unfortunately, like a muscle you've built up, like a habit you've formed that's very, very productive, if you stop doing that, if you break the habit, if you stop going to the gym, if you start eating like shit, if you don't ever do any more exercise, it will atrophy. You'll lose all of that. And eventually you'll feel like, oh, I can't do anything. But you have to build it back up again. That's the whole point. And by the way, I've seen this most extremely with those cases of people who were just in team houses, like the Korean pros in League of Legends. One of the reasons I always thought to Westerners, they always seem very weird. Sure, there's elements of Korean culture that are a bit weird already. Like, for example, you'll see a lot of them being incredibly hands-on, literally, with their teammates. Like, they're hugging them, cuddling them, holding hands with them, walking down the street. Yet, that is in no way intimated, by the way, that they're gay. Like, they're not actually having a romantic experience with that guy. In fact, in Korea, they have a fairly harsh kind of general societal sentiment regarding gay people. So what's bizarre is these people aren't thinking that at all. They just have a very different way of interacting with each other. Well, the funny thing is, yeah, that part might seem already unusual to people from the West who don't do that anyway. Definitely not in cultures like the UK where it's a bit more buttoned up. But even more so, when I looked at the way they would interact, these Korean pros, who basically from maybe age 14 would be going hard all day at League of Legends, might have even been a pro at 15 or 16, and have now just played for 3 or 4 years just in Korean League of Legends. When they would interact socially, because they're doing that so little, they would actually have the personality and kind of like interactions I would expect from like a 12-year-old kid. It's very weird because I've met people who were 19 who were Korean students at like Seoul University. They seemed very mature. They were very worldly actually, and a lot of them like seemed very intellectual, and even the ability to speak, like they understood some things about foreigners. They could make assumptions that the Korean League of Legends pro had no clue. He was almost like, haha, oh, I like this guy from the West, haha, maybe he can be my friend. It's like they hadn't been able to work on that aspect of their personality, and so it hadn't developed in that particular sense. You look in the West, you had guys like Doublelift, like Soaz, who they might be older now. They might look like, oh, he's 24 now, he's 25 now. Doesn't matter. What have they done in those last few years? It's the reason why when everyone used to say Doublelift had totally matured and was now an amazing shot caller, I'd be like, when did he get time for this? The guy plays fucking League of Legends 12 hours a day. And not only that, his job is fucking killing creeps and then just right-clicking people in team fights. Like, well, I guess right-click doesn't always be the one that works. You know what I mean? Like, where did he get time to like develop his whole personality and like socialize and study what he was doing? Like, he didn't have enough time to. He could have done a little bit of that, and I've seen some improvement, but the idea that this drastic change, there's no hyperbolic time chamber to do all that stuff with your personality. So that's why, personally, when I deal with these people, sure, on a one-on-one basis, sometimes I might get drawn into what they're saying or how they're behaving and react like many of us do. But I try to be understanding of this perspective and give them some leeway and mentally readjust the age back a few years and think of it that way. And how would I interact with someone who's a very, very talented, a very special 15-year-old who's one of the best in the world at something? But obviously I wouldn't expect the same maturity. Or if I was talking to them, I'd try to be a bit more instructive, a little bit more compassionate, and try and explain to them why something's a certain way or people are misperceiving you a certain way. That's why when I do interviews with these people, I have kind of a famous hallmark of my interview series is being able to get seemingly the more difficult or toxic or tricky personalities and being able to expose them to the world, being able to get them to open up and kind of explain the way they think and their philosophy, so people at least understand them. Even if they don't agree with what they say or do, they kind of understand where that guy is coming from and how he got to that place. They don't just see the action and think, my God, what would lead to that? Because for them to do such an extreme statement or action, it might take something very destructive, very toxic in that sense, whereas maybe this guy did it naively, or he's just innocent in that sense, or he doesn't even know what he's doing, or it's like frustration that he hasn't learned how to channel from elsewhere. So I try to do that for all games personally, because these guys, you can't just look at the money and the status and their age and what they've accomplished. You have to consider the other elements of being a human that they might not have had a chance yet to develop, which hopefully as esports goes on, they will be able to. They'll get more time off. I think people in esports already still to this day practice way too much. You don't practice that much in physical sports because there's a physical limitation. We've got to figure out the mental and emotional and social limitations on practicing this much and give people a balanced lifestyle. So you can be a top pro, but just like an NBA pro has time to go with his family and have a life and have hobbies and have his go and sleep in his own bed. Hopefully we can get that for esports pros so they can have a great life as well, something you would aspire to. And also, like I said about in the past, how we used to basically filter out the older people, I hope as the money goes up and the status and it becomes a legitimate field, that you'll get top pros who are 35, whether they're the best or not, who can stick around just like the veterans in the locker room in an NHL team or an NFL team or an NBA team or Premier League team, who can help these younger guys calibrate and can pass on some of that understanding and things that they learned over time and how to deal with the press and deal with fame and deal with pressure and when not to be an asshole and keep things within the locker room so things don't spill out so pettily as they do in some of these young CSGO or Dota teams. And let's actually get a professional attitude. Like, if we take a compassionate approach in this sense and help these people, then we can have a much better scene. This video was kindly supported by Andreas, Snazore, Westerlund, Dean Tanglis, Gardner Wilson, Landon Thompson, Tobias Bernasconi, OllieJ, NateDOhDoubleG, Kyla Harris, Travis Greb, Daniel Yordanov, James Harding, VeXii, Robert Baxter, Lucas Kerza, Szczesny. And a special thanks, as always, goes out to my man, Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest to feature in my upcoming content? Perhaps you want to ask me a question in my monthly AMA. Do you want teasers from my upcoming content? See who the next guests are going to be. Perhaps you'd like to take part in a discussion about esports with me. Well, any and all of the above exclusives are available for my patrons, so put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link below.